He and his son inherited an old house, but as soon as they stepped inside, the walls began to whisper about a past that no one dared to reveal. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The letter arrived on a morning that smelled of dust and stale coffee. Michael Brown was sitting at the small table of the apartment he and his 12-year-old son called home, a single room above an auto repair shop where the sound of drills never stopped. He had just returned from a construction site, his hands rough with cement dust, his back aching from lifting beams. Life had become a pattern of noise, labor, and silence. It was easier that way. Since the accident that had taken his wife 3 years earlier, he had learned to live without expecting surprises. But the envelope on the table was a surprise, cream-colored, with a return address from a law firm in Winter Creek, Iowa, a name that stirred faint memories of childhood summers and the faint scent of lilacs. He almost threw it aside, thinking it was a mistake. Only when he saw his name written in elegant cursive did he open it. Inside was a letter from a notary. His aunt, Margaret Hill, had died 2 months earlier. She had left him her house on the outskirts of Winter Creek, the house on the last hill, as the document described it. There was also a short, handwritten note on separate stationery. If you are reading this, Michael, it means the house still stands, though it needs hands steadier than mine. I hope you find in its walls what I could not keep. He read the sentence twice before folding the paper carefully, as though it could crumble under the weight of memory. He hadn't seen Aunt Margaret since he was a teenager. She had been the strange one in the family, woman who built things when she was told to stay still, who sketched blueprints instead of baking pies. His mother used to shake her head and call her stubborn. But to Michael, when he was young, she had been a kind of magician. She'd built a treehouse for him that summer. He stayed with her, solid, beautiful, with windows cut like diamonds. He had loved it more than any place in the world. Now, decades later, she was gone, and the house she had built, or tried to finish, belonged to him. Jack, his son, looked up from his notebook. "What is it?" he asked. Michael hesitated. "A house. My aunt's. Are we moving?" "I don't know yet." Jack nodded without emotion, already used to uncertainty. The boy had inherited his mother's quiet nature and his father's tired eyes. He rarely complained, though Michael could see how small this life had become for him. The noise of the repair shop below, the cracked walls, the peeling paint. Sometimes the boy would draw houses in his notebook, tall and open, with huge windows and trees outside. Michael had never asked what they meant. That night, after Jack fell asleep, Michael sat by the window and read the letter again. Outside, the neon sign of the garage flickered. The hum of the machines below blurred into a dull rhythm. He remembered the last time he saw Aunt Margaret, standing on her porch, telling him that every man builds 2 houses in his life, the one he lives in and the one he carries inside. He hadn't understood her then. He wasn't sure he did now. 2 days later, they were on the road. The drive to Winter Creek was long and quiet. The highway stretched between open fields, the kind that turned gold before dusk. Jack dozed in the passenger seat with his head against the window. Michael kept one hand on the wheel, one on the gear shift, watching the road climb toward the hills. The closer they got, the less the world looked like the one he knew. The air smelled of pine and old rain. The road narrowed until it became a dirt path lined with wildflowers and leaning fences. When they reached the hill, the house came into view. It was larger than he expected, but tired, as if leaning into the wind. The paint had peeled into thin gray scales. The porch sagged. Vines crawled across the windows like veins. Yet beneath the neglect, there was something intact, a quiet defiance. They stopped at the gate. The sign still hung there, its letters barely legible. Hill House, 1974. Jack climbed out first. "It's huge," he said. shading his eyes. "It's old," Michael corrected, though he felt the same awe. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of cedar. The floor creaked under their steps. Sunlight cut through the broken blinds, catching the dust in trembling gold lines. In the living room stood an old wooden table, with a small envelope lying at the center. Michael picked it up. The handwriting was the same as before. "If you are here, then perhaps you've decided to stay. Every wall here remembers something. Listen before you rebuild." Omri looked around, and for a moment, he could almost feel her presence, a faint warmth, as if the house recognized him. Jack explored the rooms, his footsteps echoing upstairs. "There's a whole attic up here," he called, "and drawings." Michael followed. On the attic floor were scattered sheets of yellowed paper blueprints, sketches, half-finished notes in the margins. The rooms had names written on them. Room for light. Room for silence. Room for second chances. He stood there for a long time, holding one of the papers. The handwriting was unmistakable. Aunt Margaret's architecture had always been more poetry than geometry. They spent the night in sleeping bags on the floor by the fireplace. The wind hummed through the cracks, and a branch brushed rhythmically against the window. Jack fell asleep almost immediately. Michael stared at the ceiling beams, following the play of shadows cast by the dying fire. He thought about his aunt, about how she'd lived alone all those years, in a house that had never been finished, about how his own life, in a different way, had also stopped halfway through construction. The same pattern of emptiness, covered by layers of work and silence. In the morning, he woke to the sound of birds and the smell of wet earth. Sunlight filled the room. Jack was already outside, poking at the overgrown garden with a stick. The boy's cheeks were flushed with excitement. "Can we fix it?" he asked, when Michael stepped onto the porch. Michael looked up at the house. The sagging roof, the cracked windows, the broken steps. He imagined new beams, fresh paint, the sound of a hammer against wood. He could see it clearly, as if the design were already drawn inside his mind. "We can try," he said. That was enough for Jack. They spent the next days cleaning room after room. They swept away the dust, opened the windows, dragged out old furniture. Michael repaired the front steps with leftover planks from the shed. Jack cleared the path to the garden, discovering faded flower beds and a broken sundial. The boy laughed when a rabbit darted across the yard, disappearing into the brush. In the evenings, they cooked simple meals, beans, eggs, whatever they had, and ate by candlelight. The house no longer felt abandoned. It was beginning to breathe. One afternoon, while clearing the kitchen shelves, Michael found a tin box sealed with rust. Inside were letters addressed to him, written years apart, but never sent. The first one began simply, "Dear Michael, I built this house for my son, but also for you. You may not know it yet, but someday you'll need a place that listens. This house listens." He read the words slowly, as though each carried a weight he hadn't felt before. He folded the letter and placed it on the mantel. That night, he stepped onto the porch. The hills stretched endlessly beneath a fading sky, painted with amber and violet. The air was cold, but alive. He thought of how many roofs he had built for strangers, how many walls he had raised that would never hold his own life inside them. This house was different. It was his blood, his past, his unfinished story, waiting for a second chance. Jack joined him silently, holding his sketchbook. On the first page, he had drawn the house exactly as it looked, tired but standing. On the next page, he had drawn it new. Clean lines, straight beams, wide windows open to the sun. Michael looked at the drawings, and then at his son. "Good work," he said quietly. Jack smiled, shy but proud. "We'll make it look like that, right?" Michael placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. We will." The wind rose softly through the trees, whispering against the boards, and somewhere deep within the walls, it sounded almost like a sigh of relief. That night, before sleeping, Michael wrote in the margins of one of the old blueprints, "Start tomorrow. Roof first." But beneath that, without thinking, he added another line. "And maybe start living again." The house on the last hill waited in silence, its windows glimmering faintly under the moonlight, as if it understood. It had found its builders. It had found its family again. The days began to stretch and blur into one another, each filled with the steady rhythm of work, dust, and the quiet pulse of renewal. The mornings were cool, the fog hanging low over the hill, like a curtain drawn between the house and the rest of the world. Michael would wake to the faint sounds of his son moving about, the creak of floorboards, the clatter of dishes, as Jack tried to make breakfast in the half-restored kitchen. The boy had grown more energetic since they arrived. His cheeks carried color again. His eyes looked alive. It was as if the house itself was feeding him some invisible warmth that neither of them could quite name. Michael threw himself into repairs. He worked the way he always did, deliberate, silent, methodical. But this time, something was different. He wasn't just fixing someone's property. He was rebuilding something that seemed to have been waiting for him. The smell of sawdust mixed with pine oil, the echo of hammering across the rooms, the sigh of the old structure yielding to new life. It all became a kind of conversation between him and the house. Every beam, every nail seemed to hold a memory. Sometimes, when he stopped to rest, the wind would slide through the cracks in the boards and create faint murmurs, soft as whispers. He told himself it was just the sound of air finding passage through rotted wood. But it lingered long enough to make him glance over his shoulder, half expecting to see his aunt there, her gray hair tied back, her eyes alive with that same fierce, quiet intelligence he remembered. Jack had taken over the attic, spreading the old blueprints across the floor. He studied them like a language he was slowly learning. "Why are the rooms named like this?" he asked one afternoon, kneeling over a page. "Room for light, room for silence, room for second chances." That's not how normal blueprints are labeled. Michael leaned against the doorway, wiping sweat from his brow. "Your aunt wasn't normal," he said. "She used to say houses had souls, like people. Maybe she wanted to give each room its own heart." Jack smiled faintly. "Then maybe this house is still alive." Later that week, while cleaning a closet under the stairs, Michael found an old binder thick with papers, letters, invoices, and folded notes bound with string. Many were addressed to Margaret herself from people he didn't know. Builders, suppliers, architects. But among them lay a collection of pages written in her slanted handwriting, each one beginning with "Dear Michael." They had never been sent. The earliest dated back 20 years. He carried them outside and sat on the porch, the evening sun falling in strips across the boards. The first letter was short. "I tried to imagine you grown," it began. "You always had your mother's eyes, the kind that saw too much. If you ever come back, you'll find that the house isn't finished. Neither am I." The next one was longer, written years later. "After Robert died, I started again from scratch. I kept building, but not for him anymore. I built because the silence was unbearable. A house is the only thing that listens without judgment. Maybe someday you'll understand that. Maybe you'll need it too." Michael set the papers down, feeling the weight of time pressing through the ink. He thought about all the homes he had built for others, perfect walls, symmetrical corners, foundations measured to the inch. But he had never built anything that listened. He looked up at the structure before him, the lines of its roof dark against the orange sky, and wondered if maybe that was what she had meant to leave him, a listener. The next morning, A black SUV came winding up the hill, its tires crunching the gravel. A man stepped out, tall, clean-shaven, dressed in a gray suit that looked wrong against the muddy ground. He introduced himself with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Brian Lawson," he said, extending a hand. "I represent Maple Ridge Development. You must be Mr. Brown." Michael shook his hand, wary. "What can I do for you?" "It's more what I can do for you," Lawson said, looking around the property. "This hill, this land, it's part of a larger area scheduled for a new road extension. The county approved the project last year. You probably didn't know. It's all legal, of course. My company's been acquiring parcels, compensating owners fairly. You'd be getting more than a generous offer for your property. And considering the condition of the place," he gestured toward the leaning porch rail, the peeling paint. "Well, I'm sure you could use the money." Michael said nothing at first. He simply stared at the man's polished shoes, sinking slightly into the soft dirt. "You're saying they want to tear down the house?" "It's not personal," Lawson replied smoothly. "Progress rarely is. You could relocate easily, maybe even build yourself something new. Something better." Michael looked up at the house. Jack's laughter echoed faintly from somewhere inside. The sound carried through the cracked windows like music. "No," he said finally. Lawson raised a brow. "No? I'm not selling." The man's polite smile thinned. "You might want to think it over. Once construction begins, the noise and traffic won't make this hill as peaceful as it seems. Offers like this don't last forever." Michael's voice was calm. "Neither do houses that mean nothing." Lawson stared at him for a moment longer, then gave a curt nod. "All right. I'll be in touch." The SUV turned and rolled back down the road, leaving a trail of dust behind. That night, Jack found his father sitting by the fire, the old letters spread around him. "Who was that guy?" the boy asked. "Someone who thinks you can buy everything," Michael said. "Are we in trouble?" "Not yet. Maybe someday. But we'll be ready." The wind outside began to rise. The trees groaned, their branches scraping against the windows like fingertips. The first drops of rain tapped on the roof, slow at first, then heavier. Michael stood, moving to close the shutters, when a sudden crack split the air, the sharp, violent snap of wood breaking. He ran to the porch just as a large branch came crashing down across the railing. The storm had arrived with a fury. He shouted for Jack, and the boy came running from upstairs. Together they pushed against the wind, securing the shutters, dragging tools inside, stacking lumber to keep it dry. The rain turned into a wall of noise, hammering the roof. Lightning flashed, illuminating the half-finished living room. For a moment, Michael saw his reflection in the broken glass. Tired, drenched, but alive in a way he hadn't been for years. Then came a sound that made his stomach clench, the groan of the roof beam shifting. "Jack," he called, grabbing a flashlight. They ran upstairs just as part of the ceiling began to sag under the weight of water. Without hesitation, Michael climbed onto the joists, hammering nails and setting braces, while Jack held the light. The beam held, but only barely. Rain poured through the gaps, soaking them both. When it was over, they sat together on the stairs, breathless. The storm still raged outside, but inside there was a strange calm. The air smelled of rain and old pine. Water dripped from the rafters in slow, rhythmic drops. Jack leaned his head on his father's shoulder. "We saved it," he whispered. Michael nodded, his throat too tight to speak. For the first time, he realized that what they were saving wasn't just a house. It was a piece of themselves. When the storm finally passed, the house was battered, but standing. The dawn light filtered through the cracks in the boards, revealing something new. On one of the exposed beams where the rain had washed away years of dust and paint. Words appeared faintly carved into the wood. They were small, delicate letters, nearly erased by time. The house waits not for the builder, but for the believer. Michael traced the carving with his fingertips. The wood was cold and damp beneath his skin, but he felt a warmth spread through him, a strange certainty that the words were meant for him. The following days were spent repairing the damage. They replaced the fallen railing, patched the leaks, cleaned the debris. Jack found the courage to explore the cellar, where he discovered jars of nails, bundles of rope, and a radio covered in dust. When they plugged it in, it crackled to life with the faint hum of static. Then a burst of soft music from another time. Something slow, familiar, like a memory of a song played years ago. Michael laughed quietly. "Your aunt's taste in music," he said. "She used to leave the radio on all night when she worked. Said it kept the house awake." They left it playing while they worked, and the sound seemed to fill the walls with breath. Even the silence between songs felt alive. In the evenings, when the air cooled, they sat outside on the steps. Sometimes neither spoke for long minutes. The house behind them glowed faintly with lamplight, the boards creaking softly as if stretching after sleep. Jack began sketching again, not just houses, but people. His father, the porch, the old oak tree that leaned over the fence. Michael watched him, realizing that his son was no longer drawing to escape, but to remember. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of their lives fell into place. The house had become a kind of heartbeat between them, steady and patient. Michael no longer thought about leaving. The road that led back to the city seemed farther away every day, like a life that belonged to someone else. One evening, as he sorted the last of Margaret's letters, he found a final page tucked between two blueprints. The handwriting was faint, but steady. "If the house speaks, listen. It only tells the truth." He folded the page and slipped it into his pocket. Later that night, as he lay awake listening to the creaks and sighs around him, he thought he heard something new. A soft hum, almost like breathing. Not eerie, not unsettling, but deeply human. The sound of a house alive with memory, whispering to the man who had finally learned how to listen. He smiled in the darkness and whispered back, "I'm listening." The hill outside lay quiet beneath the stars, the wind threading through the trees, carrying the faint scent of rain and new timber. The house stood strong against the night, its windows shining dimly, its voice low but steady, a language of wood and warmth, spoken only to those who believed. By the time spring spread across the hills, the house stood straighter than it had in decades. The roof no longer sagged under rain, the windows were clean, and the once cracked porch shone with a new coat of varnish that caught the morning light like quiet glass. The scars of the storm had vanished, replaced by the slow, deliberate labor of two sets of hands that had learned to work as one. Every morning, Michael woke to the smell of earth and sawdust, and to the sound of Jack moving somewhere in the house, his footsteps steady and confident. The boy had grown taller over those months, his movements more certain, as though he too had found his footing within these walls. Michael had changed as well. The man who once avoided mirrors now looked himself in the eye without turning away. His days no longer bled together. They had rhythm and meaning. He rose at dawn, brewed coffee on the old stove that now worked again, and watched the mist roll through the valley before the first hammer struck wood. He spoke more with his son. Sometimes, during their long evenings on the porch, he would tell him stories about building his first house, about the mistakes he made, and about how even the strongest walls could crumble if the foundation was built on silence. Jack listened, sketching quietly, his pencil tracing the outlines of dreams his father could finally understand. But peace, like wood, always creaks before it settles. One morning, a letter arrived from the county office, folded neatly into a white envelope stamped with the emblem of Maple Ridge Development. Michael didn't need to open it to know who had sent it. The paper smelled of authority and threat. Inside was a notice of intent. The construction of a new access road would begin within months, cutting straight through the eastern slope of his property. Compensation would be discussed upon agreement. At the bottom, in neat type, was Brian Lawson's name. Michael read it twice, then left it on the kitchen table. The air inside the house felt heavier than usual, the quiet pressing in from all sides. When Jack came down the stairs and saw the letter, he asked simply, "They're coming back, aren't they?" "They think they are," Michael said. That afternoon, he drove into town for the first time in weeks. Winter Creek had changed little. The same diner with its flickering neon sign, the same row of shops, the same courthouse square with the flag whipping against the pole. Yet the people looked at him differently now. Some nodded politely. Others avoided his gaze, as if he carried something dangerous, defiance. Word had already spread that he refused to sell the property. In a small town, such things traveled faster than wind. At the clerk's office, he asked to see the zoning maps, the permits, the meeting notes. The clerk, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, hesitated, but finally handed him a stack of documents. "They've been pushing this road for years," she said quietly. "Your aunt fought it too. They said she was difficult. She just didn't want to lose the view." Michael smiled faintly. She built this house for the view. Losing it would be like tearing out its heart. He spent the rest of the day reading, marking pages, copying statements. He discovered loopholes, errors, and boundaries, discrepancies in ownership that dated back to the 80s. Margaret had filed an appeal once, but never followed through. The paperwork ended abruptly, as though she had decided to let time make her case. Now it was his turn. That night, he sat at the kitchen table under the single yellow bulb, the same one his aunt must have used, and began writing his own letter, not to the developer, but to the town council. His handwriting was rough, the words plain but steady. "This house is not empty land. It holds the memory of those who built it, and the life of those who live within it. You can build a road anywhere, but once you destroy a story, you can't rebuild it." He signed it simply. Michael Brown, Builder. He mailed it the next morning and waited. Days turned into weeks. He received no reply, but strangers began appearing at the edge of the property, surveyors, engineers, men in neon vests, who measured, took notes, and left without a word. Jack watched them from the porch. "They look at the house like it's already gone," he said. "Then we'll prove them wrong," Michael answered. They worked harder than ever, finishing the last rooms, repainting the walls, restoring the garden. Jack designed a wooden sign for the gate, carving the words with a careful hand. Hill House, built by Margaret Hill, restored by those who still believe. When it was done, he hung it between two posts, and Michael felt a strange pride swell in his chest, not for the work itself, but for what it meant. The boy had turned belief into craft. One evening a letter finally arrived, not from the council, but from a local journalist who had heard about the dispute. She asked to visit, to see the house everyone was talking about. Michael hesitated, then agreed. When she arrived, she was younger than he expected, carrying a notebook and a camera. She asked questions gently, about the repairs, about Margaret, about why he refused to sell. He told her the truth. Because she built this house for her son, and somehow it became a home for mine. Because it's proof that love leaves something behind, even when you think it's gone. The article appeared a week later in the local paper under the headline, "The House That Wouldn't Move." Within days, people began driving out to see it. Teachers, retirees, curious neighbors. Some brought food, others brought tools, and some just came to sit on the porch, listening to the wind. They asked about the rooms, about the names carved above the doors. Michael showed them the room for light, where the morning sun poured through the wide windows, and the room for silence, where even whispers seemed sacred. He didn't tell them about the nights he still talked to the walls, or how sometimes he thought he heard his aunt's footsteps upstairs. Those belonged only to him. Brian Lawson came again soon after. This time there was no suit. He wore jeans and a plain jacket, as if trying to look like one of them. "You've made quite the spectacle," he said, his tone sharp but controlled. "People are calling this a landmark now. You realize that complicates everything." Michael stood by the gate, his hands rough with work. "Good," he said. Lawson's eyes hardened. "You're fighting a losing battle. They'll go through the courts, and you'll lose more than this house. You'll lose everything." Michael nodded toward the fields. "Everything I had worth losing, I already lost. This house is what's left." The man's jaw tightened. "Then I hope it's enough to live in when the bulldozers come." He turned and walked away. But the bulldozers never came. The public reaction to the article had shifted something subtle but irreversible. The county postponed the road's approval, citing environmental and cultural considerations. For the first time in months, Michael allowed himself to breathe. That spring, he and Jack finished the last piece of restoration, the workshop. It had once been a shed filled with rusted tools, but now sunlight spilled through its rebuilt roof. They filled it with benches, saws, and scraps of wood. Word spread through the town that Michael was teaching the local kids basic carpentry. At first, only 2 came, then 5, then a dozen. They built birdhouses, small tables, boxes for the garden. Jack taught them to measure, to draw plans, to see structure where others saw chaos. The house became a gathering place. On weekends, families came to help plant flowers along the path or paint the fence white again. Some brought stories of Margaret, how she had once repaired the church steps for free, how she used to leave loaves of bread on the doorsteps of those who were struggling. For years, people had called her strange. Now they called her a visionary. Michael listened quietly, often standing at the edge of the porch as the voices drifted through the air. He realized that his aunt's dream had not been about walls or design. It had been about connection, the kind that outlives its builders. One afternoon, while clearing the basement, he found a sealed wooden crate beneath the stairs. Inside were photographs: Margaret as a young woman, her husband, and a boy in uniform, her son, Robert. Beneath the photos lay a small, folded note addressed to him. "If you ever read this, it means you stayed. I built this house for a son who never came home, but perhaps it was always meant for another. Don't let it die silent." He read it aloud softly, his voice echoing against the stone. "I won't," he said. Years later, long after the threat of construction had faded, people still spoke of Hill House. It became a small learning center, a place where anyone could come to build something with their hands. The old rooms filled with laughter and the scent of sawdust. Jack, now taller and stronger, designed his first house on the same drafting table his great-aunt had used. His plans were neat, precise, yet full of the same poetic notes she once wrote. Names instead of numbers. Room for beginning. Room for light. Room for forgiveness. Michael watched him work, the pencil moving in steady lines, and felt a peace he had never known. He had spent most of his life repairing the ruins left by others. Now he was watching something new being built, something that would outlast him. Sometimes in the evenings, when the students had gone and the house was quiet, he would sit by the window and listen. The floor would creak softly, the wind would slide through the eaves, and he would hear that same low hum, the breathing of the house. It was no longer lonely. It had voices now. Laughter, the rustle of papers, the tap of tools. It was alive. On the 10th anniversary of their arrival, Jack hung a bronze plaque beside the door. Margaret Hill House, home for those who build. The letters gleamed in the sunlight. Michael stood beside him, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. "She'd like that," he said. Jack nodded. "I think she already does." They stood together as the sun sank over the valley, the light turning the walls to gold. The wind rose, soft and steady, passing through the open windows. Somewhere within the rafters, it sounded almost like a voice. Gentle, content, whispering a single word that neither could quite make out. Maybe it was home. Maybe it was thank you. Michael didn't need to know. He only smiled, watching the sky deepen into evening. The house stood behind them, strong and silent, the way old guardians do when their duty is complete. The last hill glowed beneath the setting sun, and for the first time, he understood that he hadn't inherited a building at all. He had inherited a promise, one that he had finally kept. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe. There are many more powerful stories waiting for you here. Watch the next video to keep discovering what real strength and hope look like. And if this one touched your heart, share it with friends and family. Someone out there might need this story today.